All right, I think it's about time we get started. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Science Network's Transform Your Change into Action panel discussion tonight. My name is Reina Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Science Network Outreach Associate at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'd like to thank you all for joining this discussion tonight in what we hope is a resource for you in your own advocacy journey. With a new administration that has stated intent to put science first, and as members of the scientific community, we are really in a unique position to use our collective power and knowledge as a tool to spark change. These last few years, and especially this last year with COVID-19, we have seen that it has been incredibly tough to witness all of these science-based policies being sidelined, resulting in deep societal problems, especially to our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities who have been the most excluded from access to these science-based solutions. And so really now is the time to work towards a functioning just democracy where all voices are heard and everyone has access to information about issues that shape their own lives. Our goal for this webinar is that you are able to gain an understanding, commitment, and really step into the engagement role within the science advocacy movement. This webinar was organized by the Union of Concerned Scientists Science Network, which is a community of over 24,000 scientists, engineers, and other technical experts united by the desire to use their specialized skills and knowledge for the public good. Our members work to build power on critical UCS issues and campaigns and to realize and apply that power to almost any science-related issue. You can learn more about the Science Network at ucsusa.org/science network. Now tonight, to help us with this webinar, we'll hear the stories of 3 Science Network members who will share with us lessons learned and a synopsis of what organizing looked like to them and their groups this past year. Our panelists include Ingrid Paredes, PhD candidate at the University of New York City, and co-chair of March for Science New York City. Ingrid will start us off with how science can be used as a tool for justice and the sustainability of science advocacy. Erin Reagan will be up next. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania and will speak on community building within the science advocacy movement. Erin is also president of the Penn Science and Diplomacy Student Group. And last, we will hear from Julia Brokaw, PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota and organizer with Science for the People Twin Cities. Julia will speak on what real transformative change looks like and what happens when some of those avenues for organizing don't work. Now, before I pass off the mic to Ingrid, I did want to make some quick notes for housekeeping purposes. We will have ample time for Q&A at the end, and we will try and address as many of your questions and ideas as possible. So please use the chat function at the bottom right corner, and we will do our best to respond or reference as many of these questions as we can. And with that, I am going to stop my share screen and give the mic to Ingrid.
Thanks, Reina. Thanks everyone for being here. Really excited to chat and learn from everyone about how we can really organize for science advocacy. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Can I get some confirmation? Can everyone see that? Maybe in the chat. All good. Awesome. Great. So yeah, I'm going to introduce myself and a bit of how I've come to use my research skills as a PhD candidate to lend it to the organizing space. As Reina mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at NYU studying chemical engineering. And I'll be frank, like when I first decided to pursue chemical engineering as a degree as an undergrad, I really didn't think about what that meant in terms of sustainability or even what science advocacy really was. I had entered it thinking about consumer products, thinking about things like pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and from that end. It wasn't until I actually started doing research myself in a lab that I started to think about the role that chemical engineering actually plays in society. And that comes to things that, like slow steps, like from what I was familiar with, like, okay, when we're going to, innovate these drugs or innovate these consumer products, what materials are we using? What impact does it have on people's health as well as the environmental health where these plants are located? And then from there, thinking about the overall life cycle of these materials. How much energy does it cost to make these products? How much energy does it cost to keep the labs running? All of that. And then finally, even to waste management, where do the byproducts and these products even end up after we're done using them? And this is something that I really just learned, I think, largely from reading and conversation and thinking about where my degree lied within society's roles. I would say that it kind of happened organically over time, just learning about these things. But for my PhD, I've really focused on studying ways to innovate energy consumption. I specifically work on like semiconductors, next generation materials from silicon. But that really has come into focus, not just, in my research life, but also in the public eye, right? So in 2018, energy issues really came to the forefront when the IPCC report came out talking about how we have 12 years at that time to tackle the climate crisis. Otherwise, we're going to see, irreversible, disastrous effects, some of which we've already started to see, right, in recent years. So New York Times and other publications came out with these really horrifying, really terrifying bylines about what's going to happen. And, we've seen the effects of these, right? We've seen unprecedented wildfires in California. We just saw what happened in Texas with the winter storm and the failure of electricity grid. So I started to think about, my research in the lab feels like a bit removed from that on my day-to-day, right? I am in the lab, I do like bench chemistry, I'm making these materials that will hopefully one day see development. But there are energy issues that are happening on the ground right now and coming kind of like trying to navigate that relationship of where I can lend my expertise, my knowledge to folks that are organizing around this work. And this has largely been thanks to the youth climate movement who really elevated this to mainstream conversation after this IPCC report came out in 2018. And simultaneously at the same time, the scientific community was having this kind of like reckoning of whether or not science was political, which just like full stop it is. It's just the nature of doing science. And in 2017, just like in the same vein as Women's March, events like March for Our Lives, there was a reactionary moment where scientists were saying, like enough is enough. Like we need to really listen to scientists, stand by science, and not just that, but also speak up for it. Like it's not enough to just do lab work and, get our funding and generate papers and kind of keep science in that kind of black box that's like locked up, but really thinking about the role of science again, like in the public eye and how science serves society. And that for me was really a turning point where I started to say like, oh, there are other scientists and grad students, especially around me, who care about these issues. And that's when it kind of became, like me and a friend were talking and organizing, like, like let's go to these protests together in the city. Let's just like see what it's about. And then looking more internally about like what we can do within our scientific community. So that's kind of like how we went from empowering other scientists, really meeting with people within our community and like uplifting each other's voices, to thinking about how we can take the knowledge that we have and really educating each other about the exciting science that other people are doing around us, but also the general public about all this exciting science, which is largely publicly funded. So in that way, scientific information should be like accessible to those who are, paying for it and also like reap the benefits of it, but also thinking about how we can use scientific knowledge less as like, a body of textbook knowledge and equations, but really a framework for folks to think about what's going on in their communities. And that got me to thinking about the roles that we play in the lab and how everyone really has their own niche. So this is a graphic that I did not make. It's from the Sunrise Movement. And what they really expertly did was really try to find, like everyone has a voice. It's just about how we can uplift that voice and really amplify it. And that depends on like what role you see yourself fitting into. Like do you really enjoy being on social media? Do you enjoy thinking about like TikTok dances and memes that you can publish? Do you like organizing meetings? Do you like hosting things? Do you really like being that like frontline person organizing like on the ground doing work? Do you like, like the ease and joy of like sending emails, seeing responses to getting people on teams? And then, or do you like to be, like on spreadsheets, like managing data, looking at the metrics of how things are going? And this, I think, when I started organizing, I know like a lot of friends who are scientists all start organizing, look at these roles this way. They tend to be like, like that's so removed from like what I do. I'm a bench chemist. I really have no connection to what this is. But over time, I've really seen that's not true. And that's really what I've really learned in my advocacy journey, and really hope for others to learn as well, that, like as a grad student, as a scientific researcher, we're communicating all the time. We're communicating in lab meetings to make figures. We're writing papers for other scientists to read. We're giving talks. We're doing outreach. And that really can be something that can be leveraged outside of our lab space. We're also, coordinating lab meetings, sometimes coordinating, like graduate recruitment is going on right now. So if you're a grad student, maybe you're involved with that. And Action Lead is really just like the act of like pursuing your thesis in a way. It really takes a lot of resilience and patience and really putting yourself out there, right, to be kind of at the forefront of knowledge in that way. Maybe similarly into the way that you'll be like putting yourself out there for direct action. And then recruitment lead, right? This is like finding undergrads to join your group, looking for collaborators at fellow institutions, really building a team around yourself, around a common mission. Maybe it's not, like finding that missing piece of data that you need a collaborator for to get a paper out, but it might be, everyone in the organization, like at March for Science, our mission being educate to empower, is finding folks who have that same common goal in mind, and then again placing them into these different roles that I've listed here, for folks to really thrive in and support each other in. And then I think the most direct one, which if you're like catching onto the pattern, is pledge tracker, which is really just like, the bread and butter of like being a scientist, is managing a lot of data, thinking about how to organize data, how to present it, and just keeping track of that work ongoing. Like we're so used to dealing with all this like heavy technical knowledge that like, these things kind of become like the day-to-day, maybe you almost take it for granted that these are skills that, like when we were undergrads or in high school, we didn't actually have. We had to like build up throughout our academic careers, and can be useful for anything. Like personally, I do this like to look at rent in my area, or like budgeting is another example of just like using these scientific critical thinking skills in our day-to-day lives. And then from there, it's really, I think about, for me, like thinking about what resources you can commit. I'm particularly interested, as I had mentioned, studying energy consumption. So around climate science, while I'm not a climate scientist, I have an understanding of, energy problems. And is that an expertise that I could lend local groups in my community to work on projects together? Is it just time? Do I just have time to, like connect person A to B who might be interested in working together? If so, that's great, that's fine. Or if you're able to, to donate to organizations whose missions you really support, but might not be able to give your time or expertise to. And I think once you have that kind of like, idea of, these are where my skills fit in, and this is how much I have time for, then it's a bit easier to navigate the space of like, what can I actually do, and like, what are the groups that I need to look for? So March for Science, of course, is one, and I'd be happy if anyone got involved with the city chapter or the global chapter. But you really want to find a group that just aligns with your interests and values. I've listed a few here that I've engaged with, and a few climate organizations down here, but this is by no means, an exhaustive list. I think the main point is to really look locally and look at your own communities and where your interests and values are, and maybe like where the gaps are. And this can be, like in the past year, the pandemic, mutual aid efforts, like community fridges have really become popular within communities. Maybe it's just, like organizing a volunteer list to like deliver food or find places to donate food, something like that. Local election campaigns, which I can't stress the importance of enough, and even just organizing your workplace, like thinking about within your academic department, for example, like what could be done to improve graduate students' lives or students and staff's experience within the department. And then taking all of that and, taking, I think, your scientist mindset that you would take to approaching your lab, coming up with, a hypothesis, a plan, and then executing that and rewiring the same way you would do to your advocacy roles. And I'm sure we'll talk more in the panel, but that's basically been my journey throughout the last couple of years of organizing with March for Science, and I'm happy to talk more afterwards.
Thank you, Ingrid. Up next, we have Erin Reagan. Erin, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited to be here and to be speaking with you all today. So I'm going to assume that you guys can see that, and if you can't, please stop me. All right, so my name's Erin Reagan, as Raina said. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about building a science advocacy community, and I'm going to specifically talk about my experience building a community at my university. So let's get right into it. I'm going to just gloss over what brought me to this work. Growing up, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do once I became a professional, but I knew I wanted to support people who were struggling. I decided I wanted to do that through creating medical therapies, and so I pursued a career in science. But between undergrad and grad school, I ended up volunteering on and then getting hired by a political campaign. And it was really sort of a life-changing experience. I got a lot of experience with policy and with community organizing, and I realized I have a real passion for that. And so I've sort of brought that with me as I've continued in my career, and I got a lot of experience meeting people who come from very different backgrounds and understanding the shared struggles that we have and the unique struggles that some people have to face. So I've brought that with me into my career in academia, and right now I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study mRNA vaccines for infectious diseases. But the reason I'm here today is because I'm also involved in a student group. So I am the president of the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group at the University of Pennsylvania. Our mission is to create hands-on opportunities for STEM trainees at Penn in science policy, diplomacy, and communication. When I took over in 2018, it was basically me and one or two other people. We were enthusiastic, but we really didn't have any experience or knowledge in any of those areas. But in a few years now, in 2021, we have over 400 returning members and over 60 student organizers who work under 20 student leaders. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the strategies that I have learned over the last few years in building a community around science advocacy. And I'm going to share with you some tips to help you guys increase your impact and the sustainability of your efforts. I don't have enough time to go into everything in detail, but I've tried to summarize the best I can. And I also put together a handout that has more examples to help you sort of visualize what these strategies look like when you try to apply them in real life. So we'll share the link for that later on. Okay, so the first one, and this really is number one because it's the most important, is to focus on your mission. So whatever it is that you've decided as your motivating force for trying to build a community around this, this important work is going to be your North Star. And you're going to refer to it for big decisions as well as small decisions all the time. And whatever your mission ends up being, you're probably going to have a target audience. It might be early career scientists, it might be faculty, it might be elected officials, or the community. Whatever it is, whatever you're trying to provide for that group of people, you need to focus always on adding value for them. Because if you are able to do that, providing value, you're going to be able to attract your target audience. But if you are not providing value for them, nothing else matters. There's no way that you're going to be able to bring people to you and then keep them involved in your organization if you're not providing value. So what this can look like in practice is never sacrificing the quality of your work in order to do more work. So if you are putting on programming, never sacrifice the quality of it so that you can put on, for example, more workshops or more seminars. You want to stick to the number that you can do well. And this sort of ties in with my next point, which is you have to be realistic about your unique skills and your organizational capacity. So the first thing you need to do is understand who else works in this space and what are they doing well. Then you can identify gaps that are remaining and figure out if your skill set will allow you to address those gaps effectively. And as I said before, do only that which you can do well. So if you're already stretched too thin, don't take on another thing. The second one is leadership development, because you can do great things alone, but you're going to need a team if you want to increase your impact. And the way that you build your team is first, you have to identify potential leaders, ideally early on. And the way that I've found the most success in identifying potential leaders is looking for enthusiasm and reliability. Now, no, I did not say public speaking skills or leadership skills or anything like that, because you can teach someone leadership skills, but you can't teach someone enthusiasm. So look for people who are enthusiastic, who are reliable, because that shows that they're passionate about this work and that they're committed to it. Then reach out and start building a relationship with those people. Understand what is motivating them. Why do they care about this work? What keeps bringing them back to it? What are their goals, both short-term and long-term? What do they see as their ideal career later on? Are they interested in building leadership skills and getting more involved with your community? If they are, then you can start looking for or creating opportunities for them to grow those leadership skills that I mentioned and to develop a sense of ownership of the overall work that you're doing. But importantly, do not forget your North Star. Don't start putting on programming so that this person can get more experience if that programming is not mission driven. Just to come back to that again, it will guide you in every decision you have to make. So another key component of building a community is to cultivate social networks, because work feels less like work when you befriend your coworkers. So this really looks like building a community around a shared sense of purpose. There's a reason that you guys are all coming together for these events, for this mission. And so you can use that to sort of create a sense of belonging among all the people who are in this community. This can be really helpful in increasing retention and also the dedication of the people in your community if they feel like they're part of a community of people, of like-minded individuals who care about the same things. And this also specifically will look like strengthening the relationships between members, but also strengthening relationships between yourself and other leaders in the organization and the rest of the membership. You don't want to be perceived as being in an ivory tower somewhere. You want to be sort of among the rest of the members and create a shared sense of ownership of the work that you're doing together. So ways to do this, I'd recommend ideally incorporate socialization into your existing programming. You can have recurring happy hours, and those are great, but they tend to work better for well-established communities. If you want to build community where there currently isn't one, you have to weave socialization into your mission-driven programming. And I have some examples of that in the handout. I want to make this really important point that as you are doing this work, building this community and these social networks, you have to remember that anything that is not built to be inclusive will automatically be perpetuating the systemic biases that we already have in our society. So if you are not building inclusivity in from the beginning, you are going to be perpetuating things like patriarchy, racism, ableism, and things like that. So one way to help ensure that you're building in inclusivity from the beginning is to give people from marginalized groups power over decision-making throughout the entire process. Inclusivity can't be added at the last second. It has to be built in from the beginning. Okay, and then my final point is to share responsibility sustainably. So this looks like building resiliency into your planning while also embracing the human experience. Okay, so for that first part, distribute responsibility across different nodes and build in redundancy. You don't want only one person in your organization who knows how to run the Zoom event, because if that person gets sick, you're going to be in a scramble at the last second. So this also can look like distributing responsibilities across everybody on the team. So you don't want to have one person who's leading the team and they're in charge of all of the administrative oversight, like scheduling meetings and sending out reminders and things like that. Instead, distribute that amongst many different people in the team so everyone feels like they have a role that is important. This is also really helpful for building accountability. If you're struggling with people not showing up to meetings or not feeling very engaged in the team, this is a way that you can address that. If the person who takes notes at your meetings sees that there's a meeting coming up, they know it's important that they come, because if not, then they're going to have to figure out who else will take notes at the last second. And so that can be a great way to sort of build accountability and an increased sense of ownership over the work. Another thing that's really important is for you to create clear pathways for people to get help if they need it, and cultivate a culture of transparency and acceptance. Because even if you have these pathways, people might not use them, because if they're struggling, they might want to put on a brave face and just kind of get through it and not have to admit that they need help. And one way that you as a leader can really sort of set the tone is if you publicly admit, for example, when you are struggling with something, and make that totally open. Repeatedly remind people that we know that they have other things going on besides this work. They have jobs, they have families, they have pets. Sometimes they get sick. They may have mental health struggles or disability status. There are a lot of other components to who they are, aside from just being on this team. This work, however important it may be, does not come before people. And the people that you work with are not just their productivity. So when life happens, as it inevitably will, you have to come together and support each other. If somebody is struggling with their mental health or housing or food insecurity or their disability status, you have to work together to support them. So sometimes this looks like alleviating group responsibilities. Maybe somebody else will take care of their slides for the next meeting. It also might look like improving accommodations for team members, but it also might look like dropping off groceries for somebody who is struggling with a disability and is unable to get to the grocery store one week. Or it might look like taking care of somebody's dog because they are struggling with their mental health and they're not able to take care of that additional responsibility right now. So you have to think a little bit more broadly, not just in the context where you work with somebody, but they're sort of a holistic view of the whole person. So with that, I actually am right on time. So if you guys have extra questions after the end of this, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I put my email in the bottom left-hand corner, and I am really looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Erin. We are going to move on to Julia's presentation. Julia, you are free to take control.
Great, thank you. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here tonight. I know that it's been a year since our lives changed so dramatically because of COVID, and I'm so sincerely grateful for you all being here. I'm also really honored to be on this panel alongside these amazing science organizers, and I'm really humbled and inspired by their work, and I'm eagerly excited to incorporate some of their ideas into the organizing we do. I'm usually the one listening to these types of panels versus being on them, so I have a lot to learn from what they shared, and I'm excited to learn from everybody in the audience as well. Many thanks to UCS. I just really want to encourage people to take advantage of all their programming and funding. They've made a lot of the work of our chapter possible. So like they said, I'm Julia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm representing Science for the People Twin Cities chapter. I'm a fourth year graduate student studying wild bee ecology and prairie restoration. For my statement, I'm going to give a bit of a background about our group and share about some of our efforts against the Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline that is currently being constructed in northern Minnesota. The National Science for the People organization actually began in the 1960s out of the anti-war movement and the growing social and political consciousness of that time. Scientists were beginning to question how their research was being used for militarization, imperialism, and enabling racist policy, among other things. They organized to push back against their scientific societies and created spaces for critical engagement and political awareness in the sciences. A major part of this work was publishing a magazine with articles that explored the political nature of science and was written for a broad audience. And you can see the cover page of a magazine from the 1970s, talking about many of the same issues that we are still grappling with today. After 2 decades, the organization filtered out into different local groups, but was revived in 2014, and chapters sprang up across the country. And they also revived to publish the Science for the People magazine. Our chapter in the Twin Cities began in the summer of 2018 with a group of us, friends and colleagues, who are already engaging in various advocacy and organizing projects, came together after one of our friends happened to meet some folks from the Science for the People New York City chapter. And so the analysis of and vision of Science for the People gave words and stories to the feelings and struggles many of us were having. And it created a space to to harness our collective capacity, our projects, and our perspectives. Most of the early work was talking to each other about existential questions about where science and scientists fit into broader struggles for justice, reading and learning history together, talking through the realities and issues we faced in our day-to-day science, and showing up at community events and actions to get to know people, hosting workshops with our peers, and more. And most importantly, having a lot of fun together. Our chapter sees all science as inherently political because it is a practice and institution that reflects our society, and society reflects our science. We understand that funding structures, incentives in public and private institutions, and personal and professional biases all influence how our science is performed and interpreted. We also know, like the panelists have mentioned already, that the participation of those most impacted by systems of oppression, those operating on these intersectional axes of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, racism, and others, these communities are often excluded from science, meaning that more often than not, science exists to perpetuate existing forms of power and oppression, either purposely or inadvertently. Our group does not see science as somehow objective or neutral. It's neutral and used in ways by bad actors, but instead the Western sciences have always been a part of a very political project. If you look closely enough at any field of science, even seemingly basic research fields, and like Ingrid mentioned, many of which are publicly funded, you can find examples of this. Our chapter sees the need to not only use science as a tool for human and environmental well-being and for social justice, but we also need to transform the practice of science and transform the institutions of science as well. To transform our science into action means to be open and willing to transform ourselves as individuals, transform our ideas of what science is and what it can be, and transform to reimagine how knowledge is produced and how it's valued. We can't expect to change anyone's minds if we aren't willing to be changed ourselves. I know that I personally have been deeply changed through this work. If we want to transform our science into action, how might we change our workplaces and institutions to enable us to ask the questions that support life and humanity? How might we invite and work with community to ask and answer these questions? What does that look like, and who is already doing it, and what can we learn from them? Our chapter is also very critical of legislative advocacy. Too often, science advocacy means getting scientists to talk to their legislators or lawmakers, which is good, but that type of advocacy alone isn't sufficient for transformative change. The system of government in the United States, as we know, is founded on violence and dispossession of land from Indigenous peoples, and it continues to operate that way. I know that can be maybe hard to hear, it's hard to say. And it makes me feel very angry because it feels like my entire education was a lie and an indoctrination into US nationalism. So our chapter tries to be very clear-eyed about how US power will continue to adapt itself to create new branding and new eras, but still enact the same harms. This is not to say that engaging in legislative advocacy isn't important, but to highlight that it is fraught and full of tension. It's important to make sure that legislative science advocacy is rooted in raising consciousness about power dynamics, to shift power relations, to make sure it builds and shares capacity rather than concentrate it. For example, being very wary of creating more science advisory committees that more often than not throughout history have actually buffered those in power from grassroots change from below. Over the past few years, our chapter has been and continues to fight against the Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline. For those who haven't heard of it or aren't aware, this is a pipeline that starts in the Alberta tar sands and moves crude oil across the country. It crosses through Indigenous land and treaty territory. If you're not familiar with what that means, treaty territory and treaty rights are foundational laws between two sovereign nations, in this case, the United States and Indigenous nations, often drafted and signed under duress and manipulation, and the US has almost never upheld their end of the bargain. Nevertheless, these treaties give tribes the discretion of what can and can't happen on their reservation lands, and it gives them hunting, fishing, and gathering rights to traditional food and medicines. One being wild rice that grows in wetlands along the pipeline route. So Line 3 violates these rights and violates Indigenous sovereignty. When it comes to emissions, Line 3 is the equivalent of 50 new coal plants being built and undoes years of climate change legislation. It crosses over 200 streams and rivers, threatening entire watersheds that must be drained in order to build it. And importantly, inserting a trigger warning here for anyone who may want to mute me while I talk through this slide. I'll give you a moment to do that. These extractive projects are linked to increases in sex and drug trafficking along pipeline routes. This is because white settlers who are pipeline workers come into Indigenous communities. They live in so-called man camps, which are temporary housing structures, and they contribute to the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, also known as MMIWR. As a group of scientists, we have come to understand that the struggle against MMIWR and Line 3 are inseparable. One of the frontline Indigenous water protectors tells people that what happens to the water happens to women. So we're not just fighting a pipeline, we're fighting against the ideology of entitlement to land and to bodies. Our chapter has waded very deeply into the weeds of this lengthy permitting process, and we've seen how this so-called process has failed to serve the public, has failed to uphold promises made by politicians, has failed to honor Indigenous sovereignty and treaty law, how agencies that are supposed to protect the environment and the water have failed to respond to the crisis of climate catastrophe. We have also grappled as a group with the complexity of how to honor and center Indigenous knowledge in science advocacy. Too often, science knowledge is prioritized over those voices. So we're grounded in recognizing that any science we bring to this issue to articulate these devastating impacts of this pipeline is not new, but only uplifts what impacted communities have been saying for decades, if not for generations. So like we mentioned earlier, Line 3 is one of many examples of US systems of governments doing exactly what is intended to do, to enact violence to people and the land. From the outside, these systems might seem broken, in need of reform, or corrupt by nefarious interests, but they're actually operating as normal, as intended. So hopefully that's not too depressing, but we wanted to use this panel as an opportunity to invite you to participate in the struggle against this pipeline. Just because Enbridge, which is the company building this pipeline, just because they have their permits and are building right now at this very moment tonight, they operate around the clock, it does not mean that this fight is over. We still need you. Every form of expertise is welcomed. Like we heard from Ingrid and Erin, you have so many skills that you can contribute to this locally and virtually. If you can join the struggle from the front lines, you are welcome. Frontline Indigenous water protectors are calling for people to join, even just for a few days is really valuable. That said, please we'll be sharing some links to follow Indigenous-led organizations so that you can follow their leadership. It's really important to come grounded in knowing what it means to, if you are a settler coming into this space and engaging in this type of activism. And we want to respect that. So please email us if you want to get involved. We are happy to connect you and plug you in. And that's where I will end. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Julia, for all the work that you do. It's some powerful stuff. Right now, I asked the panelists to come on video with me. We are going to move to the Q&A portion of this webinar. Attendees, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box or the chat box to submit those. And while those are coming in, I am going to just move into some questions that I have. I've heard the word sustainability in, I think, every one of your presentations. I have a question on like whether and what you feel about sustainability really in the long term, but also in the short term. This year has been incredibly hard, and I think it'd be interesting to find out like how your groups have adapted your efforts in this time, especially during a pandemic. So Ingrid, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So when we started organizing virtually, I think at first, like everyone, we were scrambling. We didn't really know what to do with how we were going to adapt. A lot of our flagship events are really about getting groups out to either our marches or supporting groups who are doing on the ground organizing in person. And we really rerouted our focus to then support efforts like virtually, as Julia had mentioned, like what background, like back end work can we do? Is it like getting volunteers to like fill databases? Is it all that? But also adapting our programming to the virtual stage. And in some ways, it actually created a bit more accessibility to the events that we had before. So a lot of our events we had done based in Manhattan, just because that's where a lot of us went to school, and we kind of became like the central meeting place. But it really prevented us from meeting folks from the other boroughs in New York City, where a lot of organizing work that was amazing had been going on, and we just like never made it out there. But because we went virtual, we had the opportunity to really meet with a lot of these groups, at least like on Zoom, and really form those connections in the last year, so that when we do go back in person, it's really going to be like an opportunity for us to work together. And then I think to Erin's point, which you can speak more to, it really forced us to also think about like burnout and the boundaries that we set for our group internally. I think at first there was a big pressure to like we're always online and there's like no separation at all. But as we adapted, started to think like these are boundaries that we can take with us even as we return to a semblance of like what working was like before.
Yeah, it makes sense. I know a lot of our groups it was a struggle to like adapt to this online platform and really find out like what actually works, and that like it takes an investment. Erin, do you want to talk about burnout?
Yeah, burnout is something that we've all dealt with at different times over this past year. Sometimes, I mean, I know that there were periods, not just for myself, but for it seemed like everybody I knew, where just getting out of bed was overwhelming. I mean, the rates of depression and anxiety among adults in the United States have been astronomical over this past year. So I think it's important to normalize that that is something that's happening. It is not a personal failing. It is just you responding to extraordinary circumstances. But I think that that's where some of the points I made about creating this social network and building redundancy are really important, because if you build in redundancy, people don't feel as guilty when they have to set boundaries, when they're like, I just cannot handle it this week, I'm sorry, and I need someone to take over. It's much easier for them to feel comfortable doing that when they know that there's somebody who can take over. They're not really like abandoning the team or something. And some of the other things that we've implemented that I think I mentioned more in the handout are we started doing check-in calls with people, one-on-one check-in calls, just to see how people are doing, not in the context of their work with the group, but just in general. How is your work going? How is lab going? How are things with your PI? How are things with your spouse or your partner? Are your dogs sick? Things that really matter to that person, and they affect their mental health, but maybe are traditionally outside the scope of an organization like what us are working on. So I think it's really important to build that in so that there's a system for people to feel supported.
Yeah, I wonder, Julia, the Line 3 pipeline is obviously like a huge problem. It's happening right now. And there are people on the ground doing work, but has that affected any of your work during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's sort of thinking through this question. It was like, have we adapted, or are we still in the midst of a crisis? You know, there's so many intersecting crises that have happened in so many places over the last year. You know, there's the pandemic, the uprisings because of the murder of George Floyd, and in the Twin Cities, you know, that is still going on. You know, the trial of Derek Chauvin is this week, and will go on for a few weeks, but we have concrete barriers up around governmental buildings. The National Guard is coming in, there's barbed wire, you know. Meanwhile, there's a pipeline being constructed in northern Minnesota. So it's just, I don't know if we can call it adaptation, but I think we're kind of working through the waves of crises at the moment. And yeah, COVID makes it really difficult to organize and be doing in-person work. But yeah, it's still necessary. And also echoing what both of these panelists mentioned, just really centering relationships, because, you know, our own members have had their own crises, and needing to be there for them too. So yeah, it's just, I don't know if that was a good answer, but it's been difficult.
Yes, it definitely has, and affects everyone. Ingrid, you mentioned this about like kind of using what we have learned and this knowledge of how we have kind of adapted. I know, Julia, it's not exactly a science organizing during this time, but is there anything specific that you will take post-pandemic, or once everyone in our society is generally in person and online or offline?
Yeah, I know that Zoom, everyone's zoomed out, but honestly, like meeting on Zoom and like letting people, you know, like tap in, tap out of meetings that way has been really, really nice for our team. So I think that's something that we're going to keep, to give that flexibility rather than, you know, having like a 30-minute commute to have like an hour-long meeting. Is something that'll definitely stay. And then we actually, yeah, Erin, we actually started putting like group social hours into our meetings like once a month, just by chance. During COVID as well. And that's something that I think we definitely have to do, because it just like boosted group morale so much, and also gave us time to like, you know, hang out as friends instead of just like constantly thinking about the next project to work on.
Julia or Erin, do you have any other specifics on what you'll take?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something I forgot earlier. You know, the switch to online formats is great, but one struggle that we've had is surveillance and thinking about security protocols, especially when you're doing work that, you know, you need to be secure and have secure conversations. And so navigating that has been really difficult, despite it being, you know, beneficial for other reasons.
All right, we have a question from the audience. Can any of the panelists speak about the challenges and opportunities in member recruitment and retention within their organization? You can just hop in whenever.
I can take that one first. So we, I would say, have had far more opportunities and far fewer challenges with recruitment and retention. We actually have grown more over the last 9 months than in the, I mean, we've been growing at a pretty steady clip for the last like 3 years, but the last 9 months, it really has been quite different, especially in the fall semester, because when we transitioned to doing things virtually, there were suddenly a lot more opportunities we were able to take advantage of in terms of presenting at new student orientation, or having a virtual table at a student activities fair, things like that, that got our organization in front of a lot more people. So we actually had about 100 new members from a single student activities fair that we went to, and they were all undergraduates, which was something that we had basically no undergrad members, and they've actually been a really fantastic contribution to the work that we're doing, because although they don't have as much research skill, they usually have a little bit more free time than PhD students. And so by pairing them up in teams with PhD students and undergrads together, we're able to create this like really dynamic collaboration.
I love that. And I'm really happy to see that you have found success in engaging these undergraduates. I know, Ingrid, you may know this too, I've worked with Get Out the Vote initiatives and trying to get STEM students to vote. And it's honestly kind of difficult, but that's really impressive. Any of our other panelists have any answers to this question?
Yeah, I think that mentorship aspect of it is really important. Yeah, like especially like get out the vote things, especially within STEM, where there's not, I think, like a large peer network that's very visible. It can be hard to like get people engaged to really have that first conversation about like what they can do. I think for us, so March for Science New York City is like we're about 20 active folks. We had started like just two, like me and my friend Omar, who's co-chair, and we've slowly built over time. I think the most important thing and the biggest challenge is first like finding like what organizing in your space looks like. At first we were doing everything because we weren't really sure. I think like we were trying to figure out like what are we good at, what do we need, and then after that it's about like trusting folks and finding folks who might not be like, we work with a lot of people who don't have science backgrounds, but they are communications experts, they are artists who can bring that to the team, and then building around that has been really helpful. And then after that, I think it reached kind of like a plateau. Like, like we were doing a lot of work on our own, but then things started to go into like steady state. But it just takes time to build. And I think it's like a feedback loop of that like recruitment and retention. And I think it goes to the point of like, again, like quality versus quantity, like not taking on too much work and knowing like what your team is capable of. Because otherwise, if people feel like their work isn't being valued or they don't have enough to do, that's when they start to like fall off. So for things like regular check-ins, making sure that everyone's work feels there's like, I think like everyone's on the team, like on the same page is really important.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I don't know who asked this or if you're struggling with membership, but I just want to add, small people can do a lot. Small groups of people can do a lot. So, try to make the goal, I don't know, just like productivity doesn't always have to be the goal. Building massive numbers of members isn't necessarily what you need. So start with building really good relationships and be in good relationship with others. And don't be too worried if you don't have too many people coming to regular meetings. But yeah, definitely it's still important to get more people involved and do that work as well. So just wanted to name that in case the person asking is disappointed about their membership. It's okay if there's not that many people.
On this topic of membership and getting people involved in your group, we have a question from the audience. Can you talk about holding on to volunteers in a new community or company? They are a climate startup of data scientists and tech creating global maps of land use. So yeah, wondering how to really hold on to those volunteers once you have them. Any tips?
Yeah, I can talk about that briefly. So depending on size, this is more feasible or less feasible, but given that you're talking about a new community, coming up with sort of a almost like a modular style of like structure. So for example, with my organization, it's sort of like a bunch of like a fractal triangle. So I have several people that report directly to me, and I'm responsible for doing check-ins with them. But then they have people that report to them, and they are responsible for doing check-ins with those people. Like one person can't be doing regular monthly check-ins with 10 different people. That would be all of your time. But if you are responsible for checking in with some of the new people that you saw at the meeting last month, and this other person is responsible for checking in with the people who came from the meeting the month before. These check-in calls are really the best way to understand what motivates this person. Why are they coming to this? Are they coming back, or were they just curious? Are they really committed to this, or they just had a free Tuesday night? I think it's important to note that not every volunteer who walks in the door is really going to be committed, no matter how good of a job you do at building a relationship with them. It just might not be a priority for them, and that's okay. But identifying who those people are with a lot of potential to really stick around and make a big contribution is very important. And the best way to do that is to reach out to them directly and form a direct relationship with them, understand where they're coming from, and then kind of pair them up with opportunities that suit their interests.
Erin, you mentioned in your presentation about identifying these leaders and building actual relationships with them. I wonder, given the different perspectives of the panelists today, how do you actually define leadership, and what does leadership even mean to you?
I can go. I think, yeah. So for me, leadership really comes down to two things. The first one is listening. I think number one, it's like that's the number one thing that I see myself doing the most for, my fellow co-chair as well as for my teammates, because that's the only way that I really know what's going on and how to keep things in line with the mission that we're all working towards, and that everyone's getting along and working towards our mission. And the second part of that is facilitating. So now that I have kind of like, I guess, your data collection and then writing up like the result, like the next steps of your plan is kind of like how I see it. I think the most important thing is like when I started March for Science, to the satellite with Omar again, we had a vision that we wanted, right? But vision's always evolving, and that's important to like take that step and listen to what our teammates are saying back to us, and having again the like iterative process of like, we all have this overarching goal, and where does everyone's individual reasons for joining the movement fit into that? And then I feel like as like a leader in that way, to really make sure that everyone finds again like a role and a niche within the projects that they're working in that helps them feel that they're really contributing to that mission overall.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And everybody's a leader. I don't know. I struggled with this question too, because I was like, we put so many people on pedestals, and I don't think that's always a good thing. We live in such an individualistic society that it's like, I just want people to recognize that the leaders aren't out there, they're right here, and right in front of you. So yeah, so everybody has a gift to give. Everybody has values that are good for leadership, and just, rooting it in how are you as a collaborator, how are you as a friend, how are you as a partner in struggle. So just, yeah, wanting to note that as well too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I definitely want to offer up Ingrid's picture that she had earlier with the different types of leaders. I think that is probably the most succinct explanation of the different types of leadership that I've ever seen. And I already actually stole it, and I'm going to use it when I talk to my team, when I meet with them next. I think that really what leadership is to me is taking responsibility. And that's really the only defining characteristic. Taking responsibility for supporting the team that you're working with, taking responsibility for making sure the next meeting gets scheduled, taking responsibility for drafting the agenda, or for making sure that those emails get sent, whatever it is. And there are a lot of different ways that people can be a leader, but really you want to find somebody who's enthusiastic and reliable and is willing to take responsibility. And after that, everything else is just extra.
I guess in order to step back a bit, I want to ask you all, can you speak about how scientists can see the world beyond this deficit model? And by deficit model, I mean, if we had more science that has been done, if we have presented more data, how can we get scientists to see the world beyond when they look at engaging in advocacy? So I wonder if, Julia, you want to speak on this, because I feel like there's some knowledge to be said around you being able to kind of get away from this like university thinking, this like academic of science advocacy. So
Yeah, that's a big question. I can do my best. Yeah, so the question around, oh, if we just had more data, we could change the world or something. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of scientists and science communities are sort of told that, like, oh, if we just had more data, we could make this policy. Oh, the data is not clear enough, so we can't make a decision. But actually, like, the reality of science is that it only ever adds more complexity and more questions. And so it never really gives us the answers that we need. And I think there's policy frameworks that, you know, are better than the ones we have in the United States that operate on the precautionary principle, where you don't need all of the data, but you can, you know, still protect human health. And, you know, I think I'm like losing my train of thought here, but yeah, even reading scientific papers, it's like the end, it's like they articulate all of these things and all this data and all of this complexity. And then at the end, they're like, we need more information. You know, how do we shift in the sciences to finish papers, like really stating big dreams and big goals and really naming the issues in society so that we can transform them, even if we don't exactly know how to do it. So yeah, and I don't know if that totally answered your question, but maybe can pass it to other panelists. But yeah, that's definitely a source of frustration of people feeling like adding more data to a problem was going to solve it, when actually organizing is what changes things and not necessarily more science. So yeah, I'll pass it to the other panelists.
Yeah, I think that's a struggle that a lot of scientists have, particularly in climate, right? It's like, you know, the data's there, the science is there, or like around COVID, right? About like masking, when to reopen things and how to follow these guidelines. But I think that even though I really believe that everyone has like an interest and finds the joy in science and has an appreciation for science, there's kind of like sometimes a disconnect, right, between like the reality that they live every day and like what scientific knowledge for. I think some of the reasons that Julia was saying, like, you know, we have these like papers that are like, you know, written for the 3 other scientists that are in your field and paywalled often, and the knowledge is often inaccessible, and that creates like a barrier for people to really feel that the science is there for them in a way, and kind of comes from like the top down, where I think what would be really powerful, and I think the beauty of like organizing as scientists is like to really involve communities in that process and that conversation, and like move that, like there's a movement of like, you know, community science or citizen science, as like they used to call it, to really involve people in a like decision making processes around like, you know, like what science is done, the transparency that's required there, and then also like when the science is actually being done, how is it implemented? What does that mean for a community? Like, you know, if it's something that I always say is like, you know, we can't just like slap solar cells everywhere and that's going to solve like, you know, climate change. We have to think about where those communities, like where are these solar cells going? How are they going to be put in and all of that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys really covered it really like succinctly, so I'll just leave it at that.
fair enough. And we are almost approaching our time together. But before we do, I did want to ask this question because we get it a lot. How can early career scientists get involved, especially locally? What are your tips for ECSs?
Well, if you're interested in work similar to the work that I've been doing, a good place to start if you are thinking maybe I want to build a community at my institution around science advocacy is to connect yourself with other people who are doing stuff like that in other places. sort of as like a peer support network, but also can offer you resources. So one of the great ways to do that, for example, is through the Union of Concerned Scientists. They helped me out tremendously over the first like 6 months to a year when I had no idea what I was doing, and suddenly I was in charge of this group and I didn't know anything about building relationships with people or like building in accountability or any of those things. So I got more involved with UCS and they were a great resource for me. I also got involved with the National Science Policy Network, which is sort of a nationwide conglomeration of groups like mine. And they have funding resources, they had a lot of peer support. So I definitely recommend, if you want to build this community, and I highly encourage it, make sure that you're not doing it alone. Make sure you have other peers that you can sort of lean on and get advice from, vent about things that are difficult for you, because doing it alone is not really sustainable. You're going to burn out.
Yeah, 100%. I just want to co-sign, first of all, like UCS, of course, is an amazing resource, the National Science Policy Network, and March for Science as well. We have a lot of digital satellites that are based globally. So a lot of major cities or college campuses will have chapters that you can get involved with. But I think in general, I think the number one thing is like figuring out, I think for me, I'm like very like maybe like type A about it, but like the time that you have to give. And if it's just like, you know, enough time to like attend a meeting and listen, especially if it's like not in a space that you're maybe familiar with, like your research isn't involved with, but you can like attend a meeting and listen and just like start to absorb information. That's a great place to start and find out if it's really where you want to be organizing. And then from there, you could take on, you know, like small manageable tasks, right? Like sending an email or maybe like bringing a friend to the next meeting. And then from there, it'll slowly, gradually build up where you can start to find your niche in that way.
Yeah, definitely echoing what both panelists have said. You know, generally anywhere you are, there's a struggle for social or environmental justice, and just paying attention to that. A lot of people say, oh, organize with the community, as if the community is like out there, or you have an idea of what the community means in your head that may or may not be problematic, but like you are a part of a community, whether that's in your university, your labs, your workspaces. One thing just to mention, you know, like Ingrid said, you know, there was a group in the Twin Cities that I just love, and I showed up. I was so nervous. I'm an introvert, and I showed up for months without saying a peep at the meetings because I was too nervous to say anything. But just keep showing up, decenter your ego. Don't feel like you need to go into some space and contribute science. That's really problematic. You know, show up where you care and where you want to support, and check the ego at the door. And it's a practice to check your ego because it will come up even if you don't think it does. And if you don't see organizations around you that share your values, or if you have to compromise on values that you aren't comfortable compromising on, you can create your own organization. Similar with Science for the People, you know, there's chapters all over. You can start your chapter. And if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to help with that too. So.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all of our wonderful panelists. You are a joy to work with. I can't believe all of the work that you have done, not just for coming on and talking with us, but for everything that your groups have done. I am going to move on to our resources and start wrapping up this presentation, but again, thank you. All right, I am going to share my screen with all of you audience members. First of all, thank you for joining us today. We will be following up after this webinar to share some resources we mentioned, as well as opportunities for you to take action. Here is the Science Network's contact information. We have our Twitter, our email address if you need to get in touch, and our website info. Sorry. I do want to highlight some of the top actions that we have available right now. The first is the Science for the Public Good Fund. We are now accepting proposals for funding for up to $750 for projects advancing the role of science for public good. These are from virtual forums about climate action in your state to meetings with local policymakers about issues impacting your community, we really just want to support your work and really bolster the next generation of science advocacy leaders. We are accepting applications through March 7th, which is this Sunday. A link will be posted in the chat, and feel free to spread the word about to other science advocates you know who may be interested. The next opportunity that we have is we have a guest blog series. We want to share your story about how you've embraced the role of holding our government accountable to its mission to protect the public good role. We are accepting pitches from early career scientists and BIPOC scientists and writers, and who will also receive an honorarium of $75. These pitches are reviewed on a rolling basis, and submissions will close March 31st. Again, a link will be added to the chat to submit your pitch online. And last is a save the date. The next round of applications for team-based organizing opens April 26th. Team-based organizing, in case you don't know, supports individuals or groups interested in local organizing and science advocacy efforts. It's a one-year program that will train scientists to sharpen their advocacy skills, build power, and support other advocates to make even more meaningful differences locally. We offer take-home tools, individual coaching, online trainings, and access to apply for seed funding, and also connections to other leaders across the country. I urge you to check your inbox this spring once the applications open, or reach out to Hannah Silverfine at hsilverfine@ucsusa.org for more information. And again, her email address will be in the chat box. And so really, again, big thank you to our speakers and to all of you joining us today. It's been a whirlwind of organizing this last year, and so we appreciate you stepping up into this science advocacy journey. With that said, I will be in touch shortly, and thank you again.